Okay, I am honored to introduce Dr. Matt Scott, visiting professor in the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice today. Dr. Scott, a historian, an educator, and an enrolled member of the Narragansett Indian tribe, received his PhD in history from Kansas State University in 2019. His research focuses on the intersections of race and ethnicity and identity. He has published in Ethnohistory and the Journal of Contemporary History and has contributed opinion pieces on race and ethnicity to the Providence Journal. In his essay in Ethnohistory, he writes about Ellison Tarzan Brown, an accomplished runner and winner of the 1936 Boston Marathon and a qualifier for the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Dr. Scott writes about Brown's athleticism, but mostly about what his victories, and this is a quote, meant to and did for the Narragansett by raising their visibility in the eyes of white Rhode Islanders. His analysis benefits from his abiding knowledge of Narragansett history, and I suspect at least a little bit from his years as a football coach that I only learned about by reading his CV. In the past year, Dr. Scott has presented papers virtually at Connecticut College, the American Society for Ethnohistory, and the American Philosophical Society, in addition to giving a talk to the Reimagining New England Histories Research Cluster, a Mellon Grant project of which he is a member that aims to recover the separate and intertwined stories of the experiences of the region's Indigenous and African Americans. In 2021, he received the Eva Butler Scholar Award as one of 6 honorees recognized by the Tamaqua Museum. The title of his talk is Ascendancy and Anticolonialism in the Narragansett Country. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matt Scott.
I'm looking around for Dr. Matt Scott. He sounds pretty great. Thank you very much, Pat. So thank you for being here. Today, I'll talk a little bit about ascendancy and anti-colonialism in the Narragansett country. I want to begin by acknowledging that those of us here in person, maybe some of you via Zoom, are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Narragansett Nation. I myself, as you heard, am an enrolled member of that nation, but my words are my own. I don't speak for the Narragansett, and it's important for me to make this distinction because the words and actions of individual Narragansetts have been used to justify decisions and policies that prove detrimental to the community as a whole. For example, in July 1675, after failing to secure a meeting with Narragansett sachems, colonial leaders executed a dubious agreement with, quote, unimportant individuals. This agreement was used to justify the execution of the United Colony's largest and most consequential military operation, the unprovoked attack on a refugee camp in the Narragansett country. There are numerous other examples where the words, decisions, and actions of one person or a few individuals have been used to dispossess Narragansett or to challenge their sovereignty as a community. In 1709, Ninigret II supposedly quitclaimed all the Narragansett's ancestral land to colonial leaders after having previously sought Rhode Island's help in curtailing squatters. In 1880, the state used the testimony of a few unidentified individuals to sanction the detribalization of the Narragansett after numerous members of the community had spoken out against the effort during multiple public meetings. In 1978, a joint memorandum of understanding granting the state of Rhode Island jurisdiction over Narragansett settlement lands was executed by a small group who later contended that the agreement had been a ruse. These are a few examples of why it is important to clarify authority. I speak for myself as a scholar of Narragansett history, but not as a mouthpiece for the Narragansett Nation. In today's talk, I'll focus on the ascendancy of the Narragansett Nation. I examine the circumstances that embedded the establishment of English settlements in southern New England and the conflict that arose from that settlement. I'll first provide a brief historical context, explaining how scholars have framed early cross-cultural contacts between Europeans and Indigenous populations. I will then discuss the ascendancy of the Narragansett and the contestation for preeminence in southern New England. As early as 1530, chroniclers such as Bartolome de las Casas conjured accounts reporting that Indigenous peoples, and what would come to be known as the Americas, were a gentle, simple, and innocent people who had spent the whole of their history waiting for the Europeans to arrive. In 1629, the seal for the newly chartered Massachusetts Bay Colony featured a colonial interpretation of an Indigenous man, standing mostly naked in front of an emptied landscape, with a bow in one hand and a downward-facing arrow in the other. The words above the character read, "Come over and help us." The sigil was emblematic of De La Casa's reductive construction and the embodiment of the belief that Native peoples were ahistorical, warlike, uncivilized, and ultimately undeserving of the unbroken Eden that they inhabited. The mission of those who traveled to the colony was clear. The newcomers were to clothe the native, dressing him in the superiority of English life forms. They were to tame his brutish nature and impregnate this barren land with the seeds of prosperity. The framing of the Americas as ripe for the taking helped to obfuscate the violence and brutality associated with the wresting of the hemisphere from its native population. In the charter declaring the right of the English to colonize New England, King James I claimed that God had prepared the location for resettlement by afflicting the area with what the king termed a wonderful plague. As James explained, this miracle, together with the brutish nature of the original inhabitants, had led to the depopulation of that whole territory, so that there is not left for many leagues any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein. While the charter was being penned, the Narragansett alone boasted a population larger than that of Birmingham, Liverpool, and Manchester. 200 years later, the mythology of a barren landscape peopled by a few degenerative savages continued to dominate historical interpretation. In 1834, the prominent scholar George Bancroft described North America prior to European settlement as an unproductive wasteland, whose few inhabitants were feeble barbarians. This interpretation of the Americas, proffered by De las Casas and Bancroft and the like, informed the belief that European colonization had been benign and a natural process, as the few natives who did occupy the landscape yielded to the superiority of Western civilization. I could continue to trace the trope contending that Turtle Island was and continues to remain mostly devoid of Indigenous peoples into the modern era. But I'm sure we would all like to leave at some point. Still, works such as Patricia Rubertone's Native Providence reveal the continued survivance of Indigenous peoples, whose presence and contributions are often overlooked because they do not conform to delimiting stereotypes and antiquated expectations. Although earlier critiques, like Francis Jennings' The Invasion of the Americas, laid bare the intentionality of settler-colonialism, it was not until the publication of Jared Diamond's Pulitzer award-winning Guns, Germs, and Steel that the challenge to the mythology of the supposed natural superiority of Western civilization was communicated to a wide audience. Diamond argued that instead of a fictitious evolutionary advantage, as many supposed, Europeans had benefited from happenstance derived from environmental factors. The advantages accrued to Western civilization came in the form of immunities to certain infectious diseases and the advent of advanced weaponry. Diamond explained that it was these advantages that allowed Cortez to conquer the Mexica, or Aztec Empire, with only a few hundred soldiers. For Diamond and many who marveled this construction, the conquest of the Americas had not been natural in the respect to the superiority of Europeans as people, but natural in the consequence of serendipity. Still, both constructions rendered the indigenous population as impotent and placed the ultimate responsibility or blame for conquest and dispossession on nature. Thanks to works of scholars such as Barbara Mundy, today we know that Cortez did not conquer the Mexica with a few hundred soldiers, but with the support of thousands of indigenous warriors whose communities were seething under the dominance of the Mexican Empire. Though not to be discounted was the utter brutality with which Cortez and other European settlers pursued their colonial designs. I reference Cortez and the Mexica because there are many parallels between what occurred in what would come to be known as Mexico in the 16th century and what took place in what would come to be known as New England in the 17th century. Mainly, in both cases, Europeans were not the principal actors, but auxiliaries in rivalries that played out among indigenous communities. Prior to the establishment of Plymouth in Massachusetts Bay, there had been greater parity among the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Pequot, and Narragansett. But as was true in Mexico, in central Mexico, southern New England was ravaged by disease. Demographers estimate that anywhere from 50 to 90% of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag perished during the epidemic that afflicted the communities between 1616 and 1619. For reasons not yet entirely understood, the massive death associated with the outbreak did not significantly impact the Narragansett or the Pequot. The Narragansett capitalized on shifting demographic realities, extending their influence over the Wampanoag, Niantic, and Mohegan. And by the time the Pilgrims landed in Patuxent, the Narragansett were the largest community in the region with a population of at least 20,000. Narragansett country, as the colonists called it, was far from the barren wasteland King James and subsequent chroniclers supposed. The influence the Narragansetts enjoyed in the region was not merely a consequence of their demographic superiority, because the community had also positioned itself at the center of southern New England's fur and wampum trades. Even before the arrival of the Pilgrims, the Narragansett leaders allowed Dutch traders to establish posts within Narragansett country. This regular access to European trade goods allowed the Narragansetts to become what one chronicler called wealthy middlemen, as they provided both indigenous peoples and newcomers with access to fur, wampum, European trade goods, and traditional wares. So great was the abundance within the Narragansett country that the community members gathered regularly to commit their riches to a sacrificial fire, with each individual endeavoring to rid themselves of the most possessions. Some Wampanoag even attributed the lack of disease among the Narragansett to the practice. This was the world into which the Pilgrims arrived, a world dominated by a large and expanding community that was well provisioned. This reality helps us to better understand the conditions that abetted the establishment of the English colonies. When the Pilgrims limped ashore in 1620, they did so at a location suffering from dramatic demographic collapse. One scholar estimates that the outbreak had reduced the Pokanoket to just a few hundred souls. In fact, Patuxet, the native village upon which Plymouth was built, had been abandoned. When the newcomers first arrived, they exhumed the untended graves and dug up deserted corn catchers in search of wealth and sustenance. Osamequin, the principal sachem of the Wampanoag, watched as the newcomers scavenged Patuxet, but he chose not to chase them off. Prior to the outbreak, the Wampanoag had been able to defend their territory and maintain the cohesion of their community. But by the time the Mayflower sailed, Osamequin had been reduced to a tributary of the Narragansett. The arrival of the newcomers provided the Pokanoket leader with an opportunity to challenge Narragansett authority. Greater access to European goods would allow Osamequin to consolidate his power, and command over European troops would help to augment his diminished forces. Therefore, Osamequin made a strategic decision in allowing the colonists to settle at Patuxet. He prevented others from interfering with the newcomers and provided food for their fledgling community. Even with Osamequin's help, the Pilgrims barely survived the winter. Still, that spring, the two sides made a compact in which they agreed that if any did unjust war against him, Massasoit, Osamequin, we, Plymouth, would aid him. The Pokanoket leader quickly put the agreement to the test, convincing the newcomers to raise an armed force to intimidate two Wampanoag sachems who had remained loyal to the Narragansett. The Narragansett responded to the threat of force by sending arrows wrapped in a snakeskin to Plymouth. The Pilgrims interpreted the gesture as a provocation and filled the snakeskin with powder and shot and sent it back to the Narragansett. But the Narragansett did not raise an army and march on Plymouth over the incident, and it appeared that Osamequin's gamble had paid off. It may seem strange that the Narragansett did not attack Plymouth, but this is mostly because of our familiarity with the type of warfare waged by the newcomers. Western leaders used their armies to discipline rivals and assert their authority, but sachems were not European kings. They did not rule by fear, even might, but through consensus and complicity. Contemporary chroniclers did not record an instance where the Narragansett used their demographic and martial superiority to demand compliance from a smaller community. And although individual leaders such as Osamequin may have detested Narragansett rule, they could not say the same for their entire communities. Even the Mohegan leader, Uncas, who probably hated the ascendancy of the Narragansett even more than Osamequin, sought and was granted refuge among the Narragansett numerous times. According to Indigenous diplomatic practices, it was Plymouth that needed to pursue a tributary alliance with the Narragansett. A year after the snakeskin incident, the Pilgrims, who still had not established any ties in the region with the region's most preeminent power, sent a small trading party into the Narragansett country. The colonists were disappointed to find that the Narragansett were well provisioned and showed no interest in forging any type of relationship with Plymouth that did not include them paying tribute. In fact, the Narragansett only interacted with the newcomers per the terms they set and in accordance with Indigenous practices. For example, the Narragansett allowed the small communities led by Roger Williams and Samuel Groton to steward lands within their dominion, but only by becoming Nita, a condition in which the settlers were interpreted as fully obligated members of the Narragansett community. It was through their insistence on determining and defining the parameters of cross-cultural interactions that the Narragansett thwarted colonial efforts in the Narragansett country for more than half a century. The outbreak of what has come to be known as the Pequot War laid bare both the ascendancy of the Narragansett and the rivalries that their dominance engendered. When it became clear that war between the Pequot and the newcomers was imminent. Both sides sought to establish an alliance with the Narragansett. Roger Williams spoke of the potentiality of an indigenous alliance in apocalyptic terms. The reality was that 15 years after they first landed in Patuxent, the newcomers were not yet able to determine outcomes on Carroll Island. That authority needed to be rested in the Narragansett, and the war provided the colonists with the opportunity. Barbara Mundy argues that a key factor in Spanish victory over the Mexica was the willingness of the Europeans to resort to extreme and terrifying brutality. For example, during the celebration at a temple in Tenochtitlan, Spanish forces and their indigenous allies locked the doors, blocked the exits, and killed hundreds of unarmed worshipers in an unprovoked attack. There are strong resemblances between the assault at the Mexican temple in 1520 and the burning of the Pequot fort in 1636. Principally, during both events, the indigenous population was horrified by the brutality employed by the newcomers. The Narragansett, who had allied themselves with the English, left the field in disgust, refusing to participate in the genocidal attack. It was clear that the Narragansett had only agreed to the alliance in hopes of, as one contemporary claimed, augmenting their own kingdom, as they wanted to be the only masters of the Indians. It is possible that the Narragansett felt pressure to grow their community because the Massachusetts Bay was experiencing what is now known as the Great Migration. And the power and influence of the newcomers seemed to be growing by the day. After securing victory over the Pequot, colonial leaders sought to usurp Narragansetts as the region's hegemonic power. These efforts were mainly evidenced by the colonial leadership's attempt to prop up and support smaller indigenous communities who expressed interest in ending their tributary relationship with the Narragansett. For example, Uncas and the Montauk leader, Wyandotte, had witnessed Osamequin's success and hoped that an alliance with the newcomers would release them from any obligations and tribute due to the Narragansett. Wyandotte even queried the colonial leaders, "How can I pay tribute to the English if they allow the Nyantics and others to steal it from me at will?" Colonial leaders would continue to intercede on the behalf of these smaller polities, demanding that the Narragansett come to Boston to explain their side of the story whenever their rivals levied complaints against them. At one such meeting, Mayantonomi, principal sachem of the Narragansett, asked why colonial leaders entertained such accusations. The sachem explained that we are as a great tree when the other communities were but as twigs. But the conflation was no accident. Instead, it was part of a strategy pursued by colonial leaders to wrest smaller polities out from under the authority of the Narragansett Nation. However, the Narragansett fought these efforts by visiting allies and tributaries bearing gifts that intended to reaffirm relationships. In fact, while Wyandotte was away complaining to leaders in Boston, the Narragansett were in Montauk speaking to the elders who affirmed the continued alliance of their community regardless of their sachem's ambitions. Colonial leaders interpreted these diplomatic efforts as evidence of conspiracy. And in a way, they were correct. The Narragansetts did intend to offer communities throughout the region, both indigenous and European, an alternative to the tyrannical and self-serving rule of the Puritans. In fact, Roger Williams was able to pursue his experiment in religious freedom because his community enjoyed the support and protection of the Narragansett. In 1644, the Narragansett had grown weary of Boston's continual interference and demands to parley, and Canonicus sent Samuel Groton to England to hand deliver a message to King Charles, submitting the tribe to the authority of the king. The move was strategic, as it clarified Narragansett authority over what would become Rhode Island. and affirmed the status of their community as equals to that of Massachusetts Bay. The utility of subjecting themselves to the authority of the king was evident just 1 month after Groton delivered the letter. By this time, when Massachusetts authorities summoned Narragansett leaders to Boston, Hesychus and Canonicus refused the order, explaining that they had subjected themselves, our lands and possessions, to the royal King Charles, and that being subjects unto the same king and state as yourselves are, they intended to do as they pleased. For more than half a century, the Narragansetts contended with indigenous and European rivals for dominance in southern New England. However, in the end, the Narragansetts experienced an outcome like that of the Mexica. The downfall of both communities was not a consequence of Western superiority, nor was it solely or even principally the byproduct of European guns, germs, and steel. It was the Mexica's indigenous rivals who oversaw the fall of Tenochtitlan. Similarly, it was a Mohegan that killed Mayantinoni, a Wampanoag who shot Metacom. Kanachic was beheaded by a triumvirate of Pequot, Mohegan, and Niantic leaders, and a Narragansett led colonial troops into the Great Swamp. But this is not to suggest that Europeans played no role in the outcome of the contestations. Indeed, it was the willingness of the newcomers to prosecute unmitigated and genocidal wars against the native inhabitants of the Americas that abetted the transfer of power from the indigenous populations to Europeans. Because as the Narragansett learned in the wake of the Pequot War, it was hard for native leaders to call together communities from the corpses left behind by the colonial enterprise. So I just want to say that this is, even though it might have not felt like it, it was a very abbreviated account of this history. And I look forward to comments, questions, suggestions, anything that anybody has. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think so, in the fact that there's going to be so King Philip's War represents a dramatic change, right? And I think that there's going to be more examples of communities coming together, of of ethnogenesis than there was before, right? Before King Philip's War, their chroniclers talk about the Niantic and Narragansett as two very distinct groups. After the war, there's no difference, right? The Narragansett and the Niantic are the same, right? That's how people talk about them. So I think there's a lot of that going on. Okay, good.
Are you going to publish this paper with me?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. The question was, is this going to be published? Where can you read more? So I see this as a part of an appraisal that I'm doing of Narragansett history as a whole. Talking about this particular period is, this is part of an analysis that I do where I really try to look at this history from an indigenous perspective. I talk about leaders such as Uncas and Osamequin, diplomats, as statesmen, as they're the ones who are kind of really controlling what is happening in New England in these early, what becomes known as New England in these early days. So this is part of that, right? I gave a talk not too long ago where I really look at Rhode Island and the settlement there, and how, principled the Narragansett were. So this whole early part is just a examining of the history in which the indigenous peoples are principal players, right? Principal in really affecting the outcomes, especially at this early time. So I see that as part of that chapter, which is part of my overall book, which I think I've been talking about for a few years now. So eventually, it will come to fruition, but it's part of that. Yeah, so thank you. That's it. So could they hear the question?
No.
Oh, okay. So the question was about sources and how I'm able to try to use sources to get at or identify indigenous voice, right, and indigenous perspective. And my process is, as an indigenous person, I think I just naturally read the sources that other people read in a different way. I use the traditional sources. That's what we have. I use the accounts of chroniclers, right, contemporary chroniclers. I use the, words of Roger Williams and all of that. But I'm usually looking at it in a way to try to understand what the indigenous people were doing and thinking. There's a technique, like a historical methodology here, right, where you kind of read sources for action, right? Because the chroniclers might have not been, focused on what the indigenous people thought, right? How they interpreted things, but they wrote about what they did, right? They had to write about what they did because it was affecting, the way that they lived. So you can kind of examine what the actions are, what indigenous peoples are doing to understand their motivations and how they're interacting with colonial leaders, because that's when we see them come up in the records. I also rely on oral history, and in a way that I guess it doesn't become the source as far as documentation, it becomes the source as investigation. And what I mean by that is a lot of the oral history that indigenous peoples have, sometimes it challenges the traditional narrative. And then it makes you think, well, why is that story different than the traditional narrative? And it makes me look at the traditional narrative in a way in which I'm more skeptical of it, in a way in which I'm trying to understand how the oral account could be part of this story too. And a lot of times you'll find that the record, right, the documents do support the oral accounts too, but you just have to look at it.
I have a thought with you. About
so thank you for the question. They could hear. So the question was about the 1880 list, tribal roll, right? That was used as the list of who would gain, I guess, I forget, compensation for detribalization, right? So it's like the official list of Narragansetts, right, at 1880. So yes, there's lots of missing from that record, right? Prior to the 1880 Detribalization Act, a sizable population of Narragansett had left Southern Rhode Island, right? They had gone to live in Western New York with the Oneida, and then from then to what is now Wisconsin, Brotherton. I think that it's called the Brotherton movement. I think after, get the numbers, but the Brotherton tribe, the Brotherton Indians were comprised of at least 30% Narragansett. So it was a pretty big exodus from the region. Most of those people are not going to be on the 1880 rolls. Most people who moved from Southern traditional land, right, Southern Rhode Island, are not on the 1880 rolls. It was the people that were part of that really tight, close-knit community that stayed around the reservation. And we still have, holdovers from that today, right? There's differences between groups that are near the reservation and groups that are not. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Mike, thank you for your presentation. I want to know more about your research. I'm going to ask a question that might not be directly connected to what you're doing, but I'm curious. There is new literature in Latin America trying to understand a lot about the intersection between indigenous people and people of African descent and the making of race. Also, the sociology of race in Latin America would analyze people of African descent, miscegenation, and indigenous people were considered almost as if they were not part of it. I think that's not a kind of research you're doing like them. How much research you can do about these intersections and also the making of race in North America.
Okay, so the question was about the intersection between African American and indigenous, right, as far as making race in Rhode Island and in North America. So that actually is a big part of the Narragansett experience, right? Rhode Island, as a lot of people know, was a major player in the transatlantic slave trade. Rhode Island itself held a sizable population of enslaved people of African descent, more per capita than any of the other New England colonies. So when slavery is going on and when it ends, there's this push to kind of rewrite the history of New England and Rhode Island. And the rewrite is that this was always a free land with free people, industrious, hard work. And the people of African descent that were a testimony to the falsehood that story was, were kind of marginalized, right? And they were put into or relegated to certain communities. And part of that was, living amongst indigenous peoples, right? And becoming part of that community. So there was lots of intermarriage and lots of joining together of Black indigenous peoples. So much so that we talked about the 1880 detribalization. That is one of the major criticisms, I guess, of that state authorities have of the Narragansett, is that they look, I guess, like they're of African descent because they had intermarried, had people of African descent become part of their community. And there's a disconnect there because and I talked a little bit about this in here, right? But not in great detail. Traditionally, the indigenous peoples in the region, especially the Narragansett, participation in their community was not based on race at all, right? I talked a little bit about Uncas, right? Uncas going back and forth, but people moved in between sachems and communities as far as, they felt they could get the most or the most protection or the most benefit from those people, right? So there wasn't hard and fast rules about who could be part of what community. It was more open. So the way that communities were, I guess, defined was through this reciprocal relationship, right? If you were part of that community, your effort, your work, right, your labor was given to that community, right? Your loyalty was given to that community. And that's how it was understood, right? And that's how it would be. So that had nothing to do with race, right? And so that's the traditional interpretation of who could and who couldn't be Narragansett. So that when the 1800s come along and the state leaders are saying, well, you're not Narragansett if you're intermixing or you have mixed blood, you're not 100% native. That was a foreign concept for them because they're saying, well, no, we determined who was Narragansett. We've always determined who was Narragansett, right? So that dynamic of race becomes a big part of the story. So much so that as we move into the 20th century, race is going to still be a big deal because it speaks to authenticity, right? A lot of people outside of the community and even some people within inside of the community are going to see African features or things that are hallmarks of African ancestry as signs of inauthenticity, right? And that's going to be a problem with the tribal communities.
When did Ascendancy begin?
So Osamequin's tributary relationship with the Narragansett is going to begin prior to the colonists' arrival in Plymouth. There's some accounts where they're talking about the Narragansett summoning Osamequin to Narragansett country, right? His obligation was to go there, and that he had, that part of that relationship was him, paying homage to the fact that the Narragansetts were the demographic hegemonic power at the time. So to say exactly when, it's kind of tricky with the records, but by the time that the colonists show up, that relationship is established. And I don't think that that relationship was long tenured because Osamequin brooded under it, which means that he had experienced it different ways, especially, and there's a quote from one of the chroniclers where it talks about how Osamequin talks about how great his father was, and his power in the community, how expansive it was, and that he wasn't enjoying the same kind of leadership. So in between his father and the arrival of the Pilgrims, there's that relationship changes. I talked a little bit about that epidemic, right? The epidemic really ravaged the Wampanoag, right? And really changed their relationship with communities that they interact. Okay.
In your research, the concept where we use words.
Yeah, so there's lots of things that are, that stick with you. I think one of them, and I kind of talked a little bit about it, was when Maya Antonomi tried to define the Narragansett relationship with other indigenous peoples in the region. And he seemed exasperated when he was speaking to colonial leaders. He just couldn't understand why they kept trying to equate the Narragansett with the other smaller communities in the region. And I feel like, he spoke in indigenous terms and indigenous language that was quite clear to say that, our community is a great tree and these other communities are twigs. And trying to explain that this was the difference, right? And bring that home. I really like that. To understand, how they're trying to communicate to the colonial leaders the dynamics of indigenous relationships, right?
I'm not sure if it was in the American Philosophical Society stuff. But one of those, we were talking about the research that we were doing on Providence.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So really just one of the things that really kind of motivated in this research to do is try to understand tenure and I guess how can I say this? The tenure on land and what that meant for possession. Okay, I think that from the record and the traditional narrative, we reframe the Narragansetts allowing Roger Williams to steward land, right, and I'm saying that for a reason, in Providence as a transfer of that land and that. So what I'm really looking at is what did it mean to be living within Narragansett country, right? And the way that that I interpret it, the way that I see it, is that everyone who is in Narragansett country is Narragansett, right? Which means that Roger Williams is Narragansett, which means that the Narragansett don't transfer land in Narragansett country to Roger Williams because he's part of the community, right? There's no, I guess, turnover of possession there. And it's really, hard to get at that history. One of the reasons is a lot of the records for Providence are burned, right, by the Narragansett. And a lot of those original agreements don't exist. But if we look at one of the agreements that does exist, and that's the one for Aquidneck. This is also transferred Roger Williams, right, via the Narragansett. In that, we do have the records for that. In that that deed or that transfer, it's clear that that initial allowance to settle on Aquidneck Island was, it wasn't complete in one let's go, right? The island wasn't purchased at one time. 2 years later, there's another deed. A couple of years later, there's another deed. And there's all these continued responsibilities of the people that settle on Aquidneck Island to steward, to pay tribute, to recognize that that their tenure is conditional. Right? So really kind of understanding Providence in that respect, right? Trying to understand, I guess, and part of that story is when King Philip's War happens, right? How that really changes, redefines the relationship between the people who settled in Rhode Island, who the Narragansett understood as part of their community, and the Narragansett community as it was during that war. I hope that answers the question. Mm-hmm.
This consortium.
Mm-hmm.
This is not non-Narragansett. Uniqueness of finding somewhere ledger,
Mm-hmm.
the consortium tribes didn't want that to happen. That was very long and soon. But the ancient ones gave us that. It was very, which is very much.
Yeah, I think, that kind of goes with the question that Marcella was asking about, I guess affiliation and what that meant. Yeah, I think it is territory and land defined that, right? This was Narragansett country, and whoever resides within that purview is considered Narragansett.
Thank you. Now, it was a wonderful talk.
No, thank you.
Very interesting. And we all look forward to reading about it.